This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 48 of season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, November 26, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Everett Miller is in Boston learning auto repairing. This was in 1910, so he had an eye towards the future. Mr. and Mrs. Julian Cameron are enjoying a sea trip to Panama and other southern ports. The engagement is announced of Miss Ruby Carter and Will E. Wright. Alvin Blaisdell and Albert Jenny, Jenne, were omitted from the list of new telephone subscribers at the south part of the town as given in last week's issue of this paper. The first trip of the Saturday evening car proved very successful, carrying double the number of passengers that the company will require to make themselves whole. Now the thing for those patrons to do who have wanted some evening service is to continue to cooperate with the management of the road and make it an assured success. You may remember from last week that they required an income from the trip of $2, which means they must have made $4 on the first trip. Fred B. Reed, employed in the Lowell Post Office and whose sudden and tragic death occurred in this past week from an attack of heart trouble while walking on the street, was born in Westford. Actually, he was born in Nashua, New Hampshire in 1869 and spent the earlier part of his life here. That's true. He was a son of George Reed, and David and William Reed were his uncles. They are all of Westford, I believe. Next section is the Westford Grange section. Good roads and the crisp moonlit evening, added to the fact that the rush of fall work is somewhat over, made a good attendance at the neighbors' night at Westford Grange on Thursday evening of last week. Groton and Littleton Granges were the ones especially invited, and there were also members present from Pepperell, Acton, Lexington, and Dracut. A bountiful supper was served the first part of the evening, which was in charge of the ladies' degree staff. The pretty set tables, the appetizing food, and the good service of the waiters all demonstrated the ability of the staff to achieve a good result in this direction, and a rising vote of thanks was given them by the guests at the close of the meal. There were fully 200 at the tables. The entertainment of the evening was furnished by the visiting Granges and was excellent and varied. There were readings, solos, duets, vocal and instrumental, piano, violin, cornet, and bells, also 2 bright short papers, the first on cheerfulness by Mrs. Whitehill of Groton, and the second titled How I Would Farm If I Were a Man by Mrs. Sawyer, also of Groton. The next meeting on December 1st will be election of officers in this Grange, and a good attendance is hoped for. The next section is titled Funeral. The funeral services for the late Nahum H. Wright were held from his late home on Thursday afternoon of last week and were largely attended by relatives, neighbors, and friends who came to pay this last tribute of respect to one gone from their midst. There was also a large delegation of Masons in attendance, every lodge being represented at the gathering. The deceased was a member of William North Lodge, AF and AM, Royal Arch Chapter, Hazaras Council, and Pilgrim Commandery, all of which were represented in delegations, and at the grave the Masonic ritual services were held. The parlor of the home where the body rested was banked with a perfect wealth of floral tributes, so many expressing in this way their sincere appreciation of him whose mortal frame rested in their midst, and their message of sympathy to those near and dear to him. There were 41 separate pieces. There was singing by the Mendelssohn Quartet of Lowell, who rendered with rare harmony The Homeland, Just Beyond, and The Christian's Good Night. Reverend David Wallace of the Congregational Church was the officiating clergyman who paid loving tribute to the upright, faithful, cheerful personality of him who had gone, and gave some comforting thoughts for all concerning our attitude toward the grim visitor of death, closing with a beautiful extraction from the American poet Helen Hunt Jackson. Helen Maria Hunt Jackson, who died in 1885, was an American writer and activist for better treatment by the U.S. government of Native Americans. She is perhaps best known for her 1884 romantic novel, Ramona, which dramatized the ill treatment of Native Americans in Southern California by the U.S. government. It was subsequently adopted as a play and as 3 movies. The bearers were Captain Sherman Fletcher, Oscar Spaulding, Edward Fisher, and William Henry Harrison Burbeck. Burial was in Fairview Cemetery, Undertaker David L. Grieg in charge. The next section is called Thanksgiving Services. The Sunday morning services at the Congregational Church last Sunday morning were very much in harmony with the spirit of the Thanksgiving season. Responses, congregational hymns, prayer, anthem, and the excellent sermon by the pastor were all especially appropriate. In the evening, there was a union service which proved a pleasant and helpful occasion to the good number present. Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey was the speaker of the evening and gave a graphic depiction of the first Thanksgiving of the Pilgrim colonists and the growth of the observance since. Deacon Osgood conducted the song service, and Mr. Wallace sang an appropriate solo. The next section is the About Town section. The heirs of Charles Reed, who was accidentally killed on the highway at Westford Center and who brought suit against the town, have settled the case out of court. The town did not figure in the settlement. The contractor in charge of repairs on the road and the heirs made settlement satisfactory to all claimants. William Fifield, well remembered in the Stony Brook district as scholar and good time companion, is in town visiting his sister, Mrs. William L. Woods. For several years, he has been in the employ of Ringling Brothers Circus, with winter headquarters at Bridgeport, Connecticut, and summer headquarters all over the United States. William has seen life in its varied makeup of nationality, color, climate, and other fixings, ranging in territory from our Potato Aroostook County in northeast Maine to our Golden, California. Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey gave an address at the Orthodox Church last Sunday evening. It was Thanksgiving all night. That was referenced above. And the Orthodox Church was the Union Congregational Church on Lincoln Street. Reverend Bailey was pastor of the First Parish Unitarian Church across the common from the Congregational Church. That's the same as today's First Parish Church. In the column of doubtful, listed last week in regard to who may you be that purchased the Edwin E. Haywood farm, it can now be listed in the column of neighborly authority that Joseph A. Sargent of Warner, New Hampshire, is the purchaser. He has already arrived with his cows by highway methods of transportation. This was an actual cattle drive of about 70 miles along the back roads of New Hampshire and Maine. It wasn't all that unusual 100 or 120 years ago. In fact, Westford farmers would drive their cattle up to northern Massachusetts out Route 2 for summer pasturage, and then drive them back to spend the winter in the barns here. The WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, drew upon their goodness' sake a Thanksgiving donation to the WCTU Flower Mission of Boston. Mrs. John McMaster was the committee that rang up the telephone solicitations and rang up the doorbell when the other ring up failed. She has the thanks of all who looked on. Next, we have a section on the dedication. Services in connection with the dedication of the memorial window to be placed in the Unitarian Church will be held at the church on Sunday afternoon, November 27th. The exercises will begin at 2:30. Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey will be Prime Minister. Reverend Edward A. Horton of Boston will give the address. Colonel Edwin D. Metcalf of Auburn, New York, by whose remembrance the window is to be placed in the church in memory of his mother, will be present and add sentiment from his early school days in town and his attendance at this old, historic First Parish Church. The choir will have special music that chimes with the historic occasion and will be assisted by Albert E. Prescott of Boston, Henry Smith, and Oscar A. Nelson of Graniteville, and others not so easily named. This dedication will be held on the date of the anniversary of the founding of this First Parish Church and ordination of its first minister, Reverend Willard Hall, on November 27, 1727. He was minister of this First Parish Church over 48 years, and besides minister, he was a farmer and owned land in the Stony Brook School District north of Stony Brook. And he was also just about the only loyalist in Westford when the Revolutionary War broke out. The old church structure, like the New England type of life, is large-framed and sturdily built, has stood the storm tempests of life without surrender, and always spire-pointed in aspirations towards an unclouded view. Next we have the Forest Village section. The Ladies' Sewing Circle met in Recreation Hall on Wednesday at the usual hour. After the meeting, a dainty lunch was served. The Abbott Worsted Company closed Wednesday for the remainder of the week. This will give all a chance to have a vacation. This was Thanksgiving vacation. Cameron School closed on Wednesday for the Thanksgiving holidays. Reverend A.L. Bumpus preached a very interesting sermon last Sunday afternoon at St. Andrew's Mission. The RTS Club, that stands for Religious Tract Society, held a social dance in Abbott Hall on Saturday evening, which proved to be quite a success. The music was furnished by Gilmore's Orchestra of Lowell. During intermission, an excellent oyster supper was served. Among those present were many from Ayer, Groton, Littleton, Graniteville, Westford, and Lowell. Mrs. Elizabeth Orange, a well-known and highly respected young lady of this village, and Ephraim Vickers of Providence, Rhode Island, were united in marriage on Tuesday morning at the residence of Reverend Mr. Benjamin Bailey, pastor of the Unitarian Church, Westford. The bride was attended by her sister, Mrs. Samuel Blowy, and her brother, William Orange, also of this village, acted as best man. After the ceremony, a wedding breakfast was served at the home of Mrs. Samuel Blowy. Mr. and Mrs. Vickers left on the noon train for their honeymoon trip, and upon their return will reside in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. The Epworth League of the Methodist Episcopal Church in Graniteville held its 5th annual business meeting and social on Saturday evening, November 19th, at the home of Mr. and Mrs. James Wilson. The meeting was in charge of the following committee: Miss Luella Beebe, President; William Gilson, Secretary; Miss Engla Matson, Treasurer; and Reverend Louis Havermale, Spiritual Director. He's also the pastor of the church. There were 40 members present and 12 were initiated. At the conclusion of the meeting, a social time was enjoyed, during which refreshments were served. The Mrs. Christina Lowther, Annie, and May Cherry are to spend the Thanksgiving holidays with their sister, Miss Catherine Lowther of Andover. The Groton School Orchestra will hold its annual concert in Recreation Hall on Saturday evening. The orchestra has been greatly strengthened this year, there being more musicians at the school than ever before. Mr. Griswold, the musical director, promises the finest concert ever given by the Groton boys. All lovers of good music will certainly find it a treat to attend. The concert is being given for the benefit of St. Andrew's Mission. Julian A. Cameron of the firm of Abbott Worsted Company is sojourning at Panama. Electric lights have been installed and will be appreciated not only by the village people, but also by all visitors here who heretofore have had a dark and sometimes unknown road before them after alighting from the cars. A few would be very acceptable on Bradford Street, one of the most thickly populated sections of the village, and at night a difficult street to traverse. Next section is about a wedding. One of the prettiest weddings that has occurred in St. Andrew's Mission for a long time took place on Wednesday afternoon when Mrs. Janie Cottrell, a popular young lady of this village, was united in the holy bonds of matrimony to Albert B. Jones, a very favorably known young man of Worcester. Reverend A.L. Bumpus, vicar of St. Andrew's Parish, Ayer, performed the ceremony. Miss Ethel Jones, sister of the groom, was bridesmaid, and the best man was Harold Pollard of Worcester, an intimate friend of the groom. After the ceremony, a reception was held at the home of the bride's sister, Mrs. James Whigham. Her given name was Ada. On Pleasant Street, the newly married couple were the recipients of many useful and valuable presents. Mr. and Mrs. Jones departed later in the evening, and showers of confetti and rice on their honeymoon, and will be at home after January 1st at 1 Horner Street, Worcester. Next we have a section on a surprise party. Several from this village attended the surprise party given by friends of Stephen Keefe in Townsend Harbor on Friday of last week in honor of his 21st birthday anniversary. The principal event of the evening was the presentation to Mr. Keefe of a large sum of money by his many friends. Although greatly surprised, Mr. Keefe responded in his usual genial manner. He was also presented with a birthday cake, which was sent by Mrs. Horace Searles of the harbor, who was unable to be present at the party, but who remembered him in this way instead. The rest of the evening was spent in a general good time, with music for dancing by Miss Sarah Precious of this village, that is Ford's Village. On Saturday evening, the same party from this village attended the party given by Mr. Keefe to Mr. Keefe by his family. About 20 sat down to the banquet, the guests of honor being Mr. Keefe and Miss Christina Lowther of this village, who acted as godmother for the young man 21 years ago. A mammoth birthday cake was presented to him by his aunt, Mrs. James Carmichael of this village. At this affair, a gold watch and fob was presented to Mr. Keefe, who responded in a very pleasing manner. The party broke up at midnight, all wishing him health, luck, and prosperity, and many happy birthdays in the future. Those who attended from here were Mrs. Christina and Teresa Lowther, Emily Collins, Sarah and Edith Precious, Mr. and Mrs. John Carmichael, Mr. and Mrs. W.C. Precious, and daughter Daisy. There was to be a sad ending to the merry time, however. Sunday morning, when the party were on their homeward journey, somewhere between Townsend Center and the harbor, some 2 miles distance, the engineer of the train that the party was on happened to discover the fireman missing. The train was backed up immediately, and the injured man was found and picked up. He was discovered lying between the switch, face down, and his face and head terribly cut. He was carried to the depot and cared for by the crowd. Dr. Chandler of Townsend was summoned and took the injured man in an automobile to the Burbank Hospital in Fitchburg. The place where the fireman must have fallen was a downgrade, and the engineer was looking out of the cab and didn't know the fireman was missing until the harbor was reached. After the injured man was taken to the hospital, the train proceeded on its journey. The man was of middle age and supposed to be French. He died later. That's the news in Westford for the week ending November 26, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.